My mother died on a Thursday in late October, quietly, the way she had always done everything, without making a fuss, without asking for help. I am Daniel Calloway, 34 years old, and I drove 6 hours from Chicago to her small house in Millhaven, Tennessee to handle the arrangements. Millhaven is one of those towns that looks exactly the same every time you return to it. The same diner on Main Street, the same gas station with the broken neon sign, the same smell of pine and creek water in the morning air. My mother had lived in that house for 30 years. She raised me there alone after my father left when I was 3. She worked at the county library 5 days a week, came home, cooked dinner, watched old movies on TCM, and went to bed. That was her life. That was the whole of it, as far as I had ever known. After the funeral, after the casseroles from neighbors, after the last car pulled out of the gravel driveway, I walked through the house alone. It was mine now, technically, but it felt like a museum of someone I thought I knew. In the back bedroom closet, behind a row of her winter coats, my hand touched a shoebox that was heavier than it should have been. I pulled it out. It was taped shut with old masking tape, yellowed at the edges. My name was not on it. No name was on it. I opened it anyway. Inside the shoebox were 63 letters, bundled in rubber bands that had gone brittle with age. They were not in envelopes. They were folded into thirds, the way people used to fold letters before email made everything instant and forgettable. The handwriting on some was my mother's. I knew it from grocery lists and birthday cards. Small, looping, careful. The handwriting on the others was different, angular, left-leaning, male somehow. I don't know why I thought that. I just did. The name at the bottom of the angular letters was Robert Ashby. The postmarks, where I could find them tucked inside the folds, were from New York City. The dates ran from 1989 to 2004. My mother would have been 26 in 1989. She had never in my entire life mentioned anyone named Robert Ashby. Not once. I spread the letters across the bed and sat there for a long time, just looking at them. 63 letters. 15 years. A whole chapter of a person's life, folded neatly into thirds and taped inside a shoebox and hidden behind winter coats. I picked up the earliest one and began to read. Outside, the Tennessee wind moved through the oak trees, and the house made its old sounds, the creak of the settling foundation, the tick of the kitchen clock, and I read about a version of my mother I had never been introduced to. I read through the night. By the time gray light came through the curtains and the birds started up outside, I had read 31 letters and I felt like I had been handed an entirely different woman and told, "This is also your mother." In 1989, my mother, Margaret Maggie Calloway, then Maggie Holt, had moved to New York City for 8 months. This I did not know. She had never told me. I had always believed she had lived in Millhaven her whole life, same as me. But the letters made clear she had gone to New York at 26 with $200 and a portfolio of her paintings under her arm. She had found a sublease in Brooklyn, taken a waitressing job in the evenings, and spent her days painting in a shared studio space in Bushwick. She had been an artist. My mother, the woman who worked at the county library, who drove a 10-year-old Civic, who never bought anything that wasn't on sale, had been a working, painting, creating artist in New York City. Robert Ashby had been in that studio space too. A sculptor, 2 years older than her, from Connecticut. Their friendship had begun over a shared tube of cadmium yellow and a disagreement about Rothko that apparently lasted 3 letters to resolve. The way he wrote about her in those early letters, even just describing an ordinary afternoon, you could tell he thought she was remarkable. He wrote like a man trying to capture light in a jar. I went into the garage the next morning. I had been in there 100 times, to get the lawnmower, to look for the holiday decorations, but I had never looked at the tall wooden wardrobe in the back corner. It was always locked. I had assumed it held old tax returns or tools. I found the key on the same ring as the house key, the smallest one, dull brass. When I opened it, I found 14 paintings. They were large, some of them 4 feet across, rolled carefully inside protective paper and stored upright like maps. I unrolled them one at a time on the concrete floor. They were extraordinary. I am not someone who knows about art, not really, but I know what it feels like to stand in front of something that is alive. These paintings were alive. Bold colors, deep reds, burnt oranges, strange luminous greens. Abstract but with something almost figurative inside them, shapes that could be bodies or trees or rivers depending on how you tilted your head. Each one had a small signature in the bottom right corner, M. Holt. Her maiden name. Her other name. I sat on the cold garage floor for a long time, surrounded by her paintings, and I thought about all the Saturday mornings I had watched her sitting at the kitchen table doing crossword puzzles. All that stillness. I never once thought, is she missing something? I never asked. She had folded herself so completely into the shape of my life that I forgot she had her own. It took me 3 weeks and 7 different internet searches to find him. Robert Ashby was 71 years old, retired from teaching at the Rhode Island School of Design, and living in a small coastal town called Westerly. He had a modest website for his sculpture work. The last update was 4 years ago, and a listed email address. I wrote a careful email. I said who I was. I said I had found the letters. I said I wasn't sure what I was looking for, exactly. I just needed to understand. He called me the next morning. His voice was low, unhurried, the voice of someone who had learned to take his time with things. He said, "I heard about Maggie passing through a mutual friend. I'm very sorry, Daniel. She talked about you constantly in her letters. You were the thing she was proudest of." I didn't know what to say to that. I asked if I could come see him. He said, "I was hoping you'd ask." I drove to Westerly, Rhode Island on a cold Friday in November. His house was close enough to the water that you could hear the Atlantic through the windows. He made coffee and put out a plate of crackers and cheese, and we sat at his kitchen table like two people who had known each other before. In a way, I suppose we had. He threw her letters, me through his. He looked at me the way James Ashby had probably looked at her, all those years ago, like he was trying to find her in my face. I think he did. Robert told me the story I had been missing. In 1990, after 8 months in New York, my mother had received word that her own mother, my grandmother, who I only knew as a faded photo on the wall, was ill. She came back to Millhaven. She planned to stay 2 months. Her mother recovered slowly, then relapsed, then recovered again. By the time it was over, a year had passed. The Brooklyn sublease was gone. The studio space was gone. She had met my father during that year, a quiet man who offered stability and steadiness. She had chosen it. She never went back to New York. Robert slid an envelope across the table. Inside was a letter my mother had written him in 1991. Shortly before she married my father. It said, "I think I am making the right choice. I think I am. I want you to know that I don't regret New York. I don't regret any of it. I just need you to keep the memory of it safe for me, because I don't think I can afford to keep it myself." I read that letter twice. I thought about what it costs to put something you love into someone else's hands for safekeeping because you can't trust yourself not to go back to it. I thought about the locked wardrobe in the garage. She had kept the paintings. She couldn't give those up entirely. But she had given the story of them to Robert, and for 30 years he had held it, waiting. I drove back to Chicago with the paintings in a rented cargo van. I had quit my job at the architecture firm, something I had been telling myself I'd do for 4 years, and for the first time in my adult life I had nothing but time and something that mattered. I reached out to a small gallery on Milwaukee Avenue called Open Field that I had walked past 100 times. The owner, a woman named Claire Vasquez, came to my apartment and looked at the paintings for 40 minutes without saying a word. Then she said, "How long ago did she paint these?" I told her. She said, "And she never showed them?" I said no. She shook her head slowly. "That's a tragedy," she said. "And also, this is going to sound strange, it's why they're so good. Nobody painted for an audience here. She was only talking to herself." The show opened in February, the coldest month. I titled it M. Holt Works, 1988 to 1991. Robert drove down from Westerly. He stood in front of the largest painting, a 7-foot canvas in deep crimson and gold, for a very long time. When he finally turned around, his eyes were red. He said, "She always said this one was her best. She called it Tuesday Morning, Brooklyn." She painted it the day before she got the call about her mother. I stared at it. A painting made the day before everything changed. It looked like the world on fire, but in a beautiful way, the way the world looks sometimes when you are fully inside your own life and don't know yet that it's about to end. On the last night of the show, a woman came in alone, just before closing. She was in her mid-60s, wearing a gray wool coat, and she stood in the doorway for a moment like she wasn't sure she had the right address. Claire pointed her toward me. Her name was Donna Marsh. She had grown up on the same street as my mother in Millhaven. She had driven 4 hours to Chicago because she had seen the show listed in an arts newsletter and recognized the name M. Holt. "I always knew your mother painted," she said. "When we were girls, she painted everything. Fences, rocks, the back of her bedroom door. Her parents thought it was a phase." She looked around the gallery slowly, taking in each canvas. She used to say she was going to New York someday and be famous and send us all postcards. She laughed quietly. I didn't know she actually went. I told her. I told her all of it. She listened the way people listen when they are trying to fit a new piece into a picture they thought was finished. When I was done, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I think she would have loved this. I think she would have been terrified and proud, and she would have stood in the back and pretended she wasn't crying. I thought, yes. That is exactly what she would have done. I knew that about her. I knew that, at least. Some things I had known all along, I just hadn't known they were connected to all the rest. After the gallery closed and the last painting was taken down and wrapped, I drove back to Millhaven alone. I don't know exactly why. It was late March by then, and the town was starting to come out of winter. Those first thin green suggestions of spring along the roadsides, the creek running fast and brown from snowmelt. I parked in front of the house and sat in the car for a while. Then I went inside. I sat at the kitchen table where she had sat every morning of my childhood, doing her crossword puzzles in pen. Always in pen, she said pencil was for people who weren't committed, and I tried to understand what I was feeling. It wasn't quite grief anymore, though grief was still there. It was something more complicated. It was the feeling of having been loved completely by someone who was also, simultaneously, a stranger. And knowing that both of those things were true at the same time, that she had been entirely my mother and entirely herself, and that these two things had not cancelled each other out, but had lived alongside each other, quietly, for 34 years. She had not hidden herself from me out of shame or secrecy. She had simply learned somewhere along the way that some part of yourself has to stay yours. Even the people you love most cannot be given all of you. You have to keep something back, not out of selfishness, but out of survival. I opened the kitchen window. The creek air came in, pine and cold water and something green and beginning. I thought, I see you now, Mom. I finally see all of you. And it was not too late. It was not nothing. It was, in fact, everything.